into the last half hour of this program. For 24 hours a day, for 14 days, artist Mark Farid will wear a virtual reality headset, experiencing not his own life, but that of another person who could be anywhere in the world, wearing a camera on the forehead, which transmits to Mark's virtual reality goggles, so that Mark hears and sees only what that person hears and sees. Adapting the question of nature versus nurture to the digital age, his experiment considers to what extent the individual is an inherent self or formed by environment and culture. Mark Farid joins me now. Welcome to Times Radio.
Thank you for having me.
The question is, why are you doing this extraordinary thing?
Well, you gave a very good summary in quite a short space of time. That it really is ultimately to start to see how will I behave and act and think. Can you condition someone to think in a different way? Because if so, I would argue that you fundamentally changed who I am and changed my thought process. And this is something that I think happens in a wider context in society, in the kind of nurturing of our environment that we're in. So it's really ultimately a question of nature versus nurture and how much of our society and our surroundings influence and affect who we are.
Let's give listeners the benefit of understanding what I would describe as the full horrors of this. So you are going to wear these goggles, and in these goggles you get a kind of 360-degree view of what someone else is seeing, and you hear what they hear, and you do this relentlessly. So you won't take them off to go to the lavatory or to have a bath. You won't take them off when you're having a meal, for example.
No, so I wear it for 24 hours a day continuously for 2 weeks. I will be in a gallery space that's open to the public. It will also be streamed online, so you can see me at all times. You can see me eating, you can see me going to the toilet, you can see me sleeping, you can see me on the exercise bike. With that, you can also then see what I'm seeing, which is this other person's life. And yeah, it really is that once I'm in this environment with no talking to anyone else, not speaking to anyone, not getting validation in who I am or any thoughts or questions or desires that I may have at any point in this 2 weeks, it's really how will the stimulation of this other person's life is going about their daily life as normal. And they are a normal, real-life human being, not some crazy skydiving daredevil celebrity. It's a real, mundane life, and it's the mundanity. How does that start to affect one's sense of self and how they relate to that sense of self?
And being symmetrical about this, the person at the other end wears the camera on the forehead, again, without cease, during meals, while asleep, while going to the lavatory, and while conducting, shall we say, broadly speaking, a normal home life.
Yes, entirely. Every intimate moment, so their commute, brushing their teeth. So there's the side of me. There's the how will it psychologically affect me, not speaking to anyone, not talking to anyone, not seeing my own hands, not hearing my own voice, having this other world around me in a very kind of Wittgenstein way. Wittgenstein teaches us that we access the world through our senses. So it's then about how does my senses they be replaced through sensory deprivation? And then there's the other person, and how do they cope with the lack of privacy and broadcasting their life for 24 hours a day for 14 continuous days, and the people around them, and how does that affect them? And where does this notion of private and public kind of stand in terms of these public spaces, along with kind of very relevant to coronavirus and digital intimacy and this connection through a virtual embodiment through others, and seeing the world in the 21st century limited to your room where you are stationary.
And their loss of privacy is greater than I had appreciated, because I realized that their privacy was being violated by you all the time. But you say that people can also go online and see what you're seeing. So, actually, their privacy can be almost limitlessly violated. Is that correct?
Entirely. And it's something that touches on other projects that I've done, something called Poisonous Antidote, which was the third part of a series of projects of mine that was interrogating the Investor Powers Act, or Snoopy's Charter, And for Poisonous Antidote, I broadcast my entire digital life online. So that included my phone calls, emails, text messages, web browsing, locations, searches, 15 things in total, all were updated continuously. So you hear me sounding like a spoiled brat speaking to my dad on the phone, the only way that a son talks to their dad in private. But it was showing that, first of all, the invested powers bill and what laws are going through and how invasive and personal that is. But more so, it was showing that how does it affect one's sense of self when everything is broadcast? When there's the potential acknowledgement of every action and interaction, what does that do to you? And what drives then your future actions and what you're saying? You start to self-censor. And that self-censoring is the ultimate form of the destruction of freedom of speech, as you're destroying freedom of thought, which is the whole kind of line of argument for data privacy arguments. And that's where with Seeing Eye, exploring with the other person, how does it affect them and those around them? My expectation is that the other person will quite like broadcasting their life, but it's the people around them who won't, because you always are contextualizing the other person with their life. But these fleeting kind of protagonists, for use of a better word, they don't have overall context. So we only see the snippets of them, and they might be in an off day, for example.
At this moment, I suppose we ought to introduce the word ethics, because I believe that you've given a lot of thought to the ethics of this. I can perfectly see that you're a willing participant. I can see that the subject wearing the camera is a willing participant. But you've just raised the question of all the other people in their lives, or indeed people who aren't in their lives that they may just come across, and at least a moment of their life is going to be broadcast. How do you deal with the ethics of that?
Well, the ethics of this project is a very big issue overall in this project, and I've been seeking ethical approval on the project. Ethical approval is when a university deems it to be ethical, and if they deem it to be ethical, then it can be used for scientific research. So we're trying to work with a neuroscience and cognitive behavioural therapist, along with a clinical psychologist who's been doing lots of work into virtual environments and virtual embodiment for the last 20 years, and we seem to be getting close to ethical approval. But you're right, the filming of people without their permission, of course, is a deeply unethical thing, and for someone who fights a lot for data privacy, I do strongly feel that it's an important part to acknowledge. So we are asking for permission as much as possible. We are going around with contracts for people. The other person will have signs at various points. But there will be times, a lot of the time, where people aren't recorded, where people are recorded but not without their permission. And it is something that we're seeking to resolve. But the ultimate legal stance is that when someone produces something copyrightable in a public space, then they need permission. So there is the legal definitions, but there is ultimately the moral side, which I think is in many ways the more important side, which we are dealing with. But it depends on the location that we are doing it. So we're currently trialing lots of different people. We trialed an 18-year-old girl who got her A-level results, to a 71-year-old woman, to a 50-year-old professor, to we're currently recording a Palestinian refugee in Dubai, and an asylum seeker from Syria who lives in Gateshead, to try and understand these different lives and where permissions are needed as much as where the person feels safe and what they need, as well as the cultural side of filming in different places, because filming in Dubai is very different to filming in London.
You're going to do this for 24 hours a day for 14 days. Are you building up to that like a marathon runner?
Yes, so I've been doing lots of practice. The longest I've spent in virtual reality in one sitting is 92 hours. As I say, we've tested a range of people, I think maybe 11 people to date, each for 24 hours. And I've been doing my main preparation is I've gone to 4 10-day silent Vipassana meditation retreats. So you don't speak to anyone. You wake up at 4 a.m., you start meditating at 4:30. You meditate for an hour, you have an hour off, you meditate for an hour, you have an hour off, and you do this until 9 p.m. So it's 8.5 hours of meditation, 8.5 hours of essentially staring at a tree, with no stimulation, with no human interaction, with no acknowledgement of your existence by even looking into the eyes of another human being, for 10 continuous days. And as I say, I've done this now 4 times in preparation to understand myself and what emotions I'll go through and how to essentially be forgotten. Because that's what we've learned with Seeing Eye, is that after 3 or 4 days, my ego starts to break. And I think for Seeing Eye, that's where the project really begins, is when the ego breaks and it starts to rebuild. What does it start to rebuild to? And that's where, for me, it is about the surroundings and environment that we're in, and our upbringing, and the nurturing of ourselves, that who we are is so clearly defined by the society that we live in and the morals and of that country. That so it's how do I rebuild? What comes out of me? That really, if you're to break who I am and I'm to become someone else, even momentarily, if for one moment, say on day 8, I start to believe that I am this other person, whose identity is that? Is it their identity or is it my identity? Because this idea of a shared identity really comes back into conversation, especially in the 21st century, the digital age. But, this is a big topic that Plato has been talking about. The philosophy throughout the centuries and millennium has been going on for. And the technology that we now have, that we were the first to develop, the first ever first-person point of view recorded virtual reality. So we're really at this brink of where we are at technology to be able to test who we are again in new ways that science often wouldn't allow ethically. But the art ethics are slightly different. Art ethics, I think, focus more on intent and what you're trying to interrogate and what you're trying to subvert. While science is very pragmatic and very good, and I think the merging of the two is really kind of where I would like to take art more, as many people would, and do I seeing I progress it.
Mark Farid, I didn't introduce your project by name. It's called Seeing I, and that is a capital I, not an E-Y-E, I. Stick with me if you would. I'll be back with you in just a moment. Just to say that this is Michael Portillo on Times Radio with Great Rail Journeys. Visit greatrail.com. We were just getting there to the question before the break about art. I called you an artist, but you're clearly at some sort of crossover point between art and science.
Yeah, I'm very interested in this title, artist, and what artist means. Because I think it's something that changes. I studied fine art at university, so on that level, I'm an artist. I get most of my funding through art funds. But the idea of an artist, it's in the 19th century, it was portraiture for rich owners, and they wanted them to paint them on their estate. And the artist would look to try to subvert it in a small little way by adding themselves somewhere in the picture or painting something back. And we then jump forward to now, even in between, there's been the power of the gallery and the gallery coming in, which is a 20th century thing. And then you come to fast forward to now, where it's become the role of the artist seems to fit into something where they're helping with the community. It's that they have a role within the community, which I think is a good thing. But it's definitely a new thing, and I think it's come through art cuts in funding, definitely over the last 10 years, which has tried to push some of that expectation onto the artist. But now, moving forward, I think the role of the artist is evolving yet again. And I think the role of the artist currently is something maybe similar to the role of the journalist, and even the role of the mathematician, and something that I think we should all be working towards right now, which is painting a vision of the future. I feel that the future is currently owned by quite regressive politics and visions, and progressive politics and people don't seem to have a foothold on this conversation of what will the future look like. What will a post-Brexit world look like? What does next year look like? There are these huge tectonic shifts going on in the world, and the world doesn't know what it looks like tomorrow, let alone the individual. How is the individual supposed to place himself within this shifting world? So for me, the role of the artist is to inspire the future and to have our own conversation into what the future looks like. And that can be small, little ways, and that can even be big companies changing their business models, which then have a bigger effect, as much as then artists trying to come up with ideas rather than just criticize. I think it's time for artists to give useful alternatives, much as journalists, much as teachers, much as everyone else.
Are you holding up a warning finger about the future?
I'm quite excited about the future in many ways, because I feel we've been all striving for change. There's been a look for change coming, and coronavirus and Brexit, whatever one's opinions are, they have both accelerated change and highlighted the fact that change is coming. So I think rather than trying to stick finger up to them or trying to, I think it's more productive and more useful for artists not to criticize in such overt ways as much as criticizing in overt ways, but trying to be productive and helpful now. And as I say, I think that progressive people need to start having a foothold in the conversation of what tomorrow looks like when we don't at the moment.
Tell me about another experiment in which you engaged where you tried to live outside the digital world for a period. And I think at the time you were about 23 or 24 years old. Tell me about that.
Yeah, that was the second part of the three-part trilogy that I mentioned earlier, to do with data privacy. And that was at a talk that I gave at St. John's College at the University of Cambridge, entitled "Anonymity is Our Only Right, and That Right Must Be Destroyed." And in that talk, I gave away the passwords to my entire online life. So from my Facebook and Twitter emails to my personal and professional email addresses to my online banking and Apple ID and everything in between. Under the logic that I can't delete these accounts. Facebook and Google and Amazon, whoever else own all of this information. That was what I agreed to in terms and conditions. So even if I deactivate the accounts, that information is still stored on me. So my rationale was, if I gave them away publicly to people that I don't know, they will start using the accounts, change the passwords, and I can never get back on them. And that is the case, and that's what happened very quickly. My Twitter, for example, at Mark Farid, is no longer mine, and someone still uses that, occasionally tweeting at me. And the idea was that, so by writing, similar to if you were to write over a note before going away, it makes it harder to read. That's what I was trying to do with my data. So then I lived without a digital footprint, or I tried without a phone or computer for 6 months. And what I found was that the isolation that caused, so socially, financially, and culturally, were all detrimental in their own ways. Financially, obviously, it's very hard to get work without a phone or computer. Socially, once again, it's hard to meet people. But culturally was the big one. I found that I was becoming detached from culture more and more and more. And each day, that separation got bigger and bigger and bigger, and made it harder to interact with people. It made it harder to really know what to talk about. Made it harder to place myself within my immediate world, along with the wider world around us. And that was something that it really highlighted to me. And Paris attacks happened 18 days into me for giving away my passwords. And it took me 24 hours to find out, because I didn't buy a paper that day, because as a 23-year-old at the time, I didn't have a TV. But the Paris attacks were something quite big. They were a watershed moment in terms of data privacy arguments for Europe. That was a very big moment in terms of how we all viewed it, because safety became the inherent thing with data privacy, which of course it should. But there's always the balance between the individual, and all data privacy arguments will always center around the individual and the ability to not conform, the ability to be yourself. And I'm shocked this very day at Cambridge Analytica. I assumed that Cambridge Analytica would be yet again a watershed moment in how we view data privacy and the ability to change people's beliefs and alter what they think. And yet with Cambridge Analytica, we saw the true extent of that. To mention something called Do So, if you don't know, Do So was a big cultural campaign that Cambridge Analytica were hired by the Trinidad and Tobago government in, I think, 2012, 2007. And they were hired by the West Indian government as opposed to the Afro-Caribbean government. So Cambridge Analytica decided to create a cultural campaign called Do So, which was do not vote. And it became a huge thing, and it became some memes, and it became a big night, and it became a big thing for youth there. And the idea was that Cambridge Analytica knew that when the Afro-Caribbean younger people wouldn't vote, but the West Indian younger people would vote when their parents told them to vote. So they created this huge cultural thing that really affected people and their beliefs. And it worked. It got the West Indian government to win because the younger people voted, whilst the Afro-Caribbean people didn't. So that's just one example of the power of data privacy, the power of misusage of data. The data privacy is really about the self and the individual. And I actually think data privacy has got a bad name. I feel that branding of it is wrong, because data privacy sounds a bit boring, when really it's about the individual in a very interesting, fun way.
Back to your virtual reality goggles. Seeing Eye, the name you give to that project. When do you think you're going to move to the 24 hours a day, 14 days stage?
So we were hoping to do it this October. The project, with the support of the National Theatre in the UK, the project is also commissioned by Art Gallery in London and the European Culture Programme, the European Commission, along with Sundance Institute and Body Data Space, I should say. We were hoping to do this project in October this year at the National Theatre, but obviously with coronavirus, that has meant that we haven't. So we're now currently looking for a new space in London to do it, and we're ready to go. We just need to record the person's life and go, but that's all done at the same time as me doing it. So we're hoping for sometime next year, probably the summer, but that's open to change.
And will you emerge, I mean this question quite seriously, will you emerge sane the other end?
It's a difficult question to answer, because in many ways, a surrealist artist would say that the difference between a madman and me is that I'm not mad. That this idea of sanity, the point of the project really saying that the VR headset is a metaphor for this wider world, is saying that we're all conditioned to believe one thing, and we're all conditioned to believe that that is the norm and that is the way it is, and anything other is insane. So in a philosophical sense, I would say we're all insane. In a practical sense, yes, we are taking my rehabilitation very, very seriously. We are taking my preparation building into it extremely seriously. I've been very insistent, as I say, to get ethical approval to allow a neuroscientist, cognitive behavioral therapist, and clinical psychologist to be involved in this project, who will be monitoring me at all times, who have the power to say, Mark, you need to stop, you need to take us off. So they could say after a week, after 5 days, after 10 days, after 12 days, that we should call off this project. But that doesn't mean that that's quite a good ending, really. We've got to where we want to find out, and then we'll move on. Because really, I want to know what happens to my sense of self. That, if our consciousness is experienced through the perception of sight and sound, through interaction, through technology, and through our conception of knowledge, to what extent is it really our own? And that's what I would really like to find out.
Well, Mark Farid, it's an extraordinary endeavour in which you're embarked. By the way, how are you feeling after 96 hours?
I was feeling incredibly bored and restless, and I just needed to get a sense of my surroundings. A bit like when you're ill and you stay in bed all day and you just want some fresh air. It's like that, except you can't see what you want to see. I was fine. It was difficult. It was very hard, but I made it out on the other side.
Well, after 96 hours, you seem to have emerged perfectly lucid. My best wishes to you for whenever you manage to do this. Mark Farid, who will, for 24 hours a day, for 14 days, experience only the life of another person. Well, we're coming very close to the end of this programme. I'm very pleased to say that Kate Borsay, who's taking it over at 10 o'clock, has entered the studio. What do you have for us?
Well, we have a feast of things for you, starting with free school meals. That's an awful pun. I'm very sorry, but the pressure is on the PM to backtrack over free school meals. We'll be getting the latest on that from the Times education correspondent. We'll be looking at the front pages for tomorrow. We're doing a big feature on the lost kids of COVID.